Hi, I'm Adam from AM Music, and in this video I want to explain to you 4 different types of dynamic control. Are you already confused by compression? Well, let's make it a whole lot worse. Let's go. By now you've probably discovered compression and you know that it can be used to make things louder. But it can be confusing in the way that it works, right? You're turning down the peaks in order to then bring up the overall level or the average level. So when we're talking about compression, we are normally just talking about downward compression, but there is also upward compression. And with downward compression, as you probably know, you set a threshold. Anything that's above that threshold gets turned down. It's a way of controlling dynamics, reducing dynamic range. The upwards compressor works a little bit differently. Rather than turning the gain down, you turn the gain up from below the threshold. So it's kind of reverse. And as well as upward compression, we also have expansion. As the name suggests, expands the dynamic range. So there will be a bigger difference between the quieter and the loud, whereas with a compressor, you're getting a smaller difference between the quiet and the loud. And similar to compression, there is also downward expansion and there's also upward expansion. Maybe on a drum bus, you want a kick and a snare to be even louder than they already are, then you could use expansion. So that would be upwards expansion. An easy example to understand of downward expansion is a noise gate. So what you're going to do is set a threshold and then everything below that threshold is going to get completely reduced. You're just left with, say, the kick and the snare cutting through, therefore increasing the dynamic range. You confused? So am I. So let's take a look in Logic and I'll explain this with some examples. Okay, so first let's have a look at the classic downward compression. And I've got some drums here, and you can do this in Logic Pro's compressor, but I'm actually going to use FabFilter Pro C2. I've got a drum beat here, just a loop from the library loops. What I'm also going to show here is TR5 metering, which is just a metering thing, but I want to look at the peak and the RMS because that's what we're doing with compression. We're affecting the relationship between the peak and the RMS values. Let's listen to the groove without it first. So just a shuffly, jazzy, swingy thing, quite loud kick and snare, and then some ride cymbal. So let's set this compressor up. So first I'm going to put the threshold so that nothing's coming through. It's not going to compress anything. I want to make sure that the knee is a hard knee rather than a soft knee. A soft knee will start to compress it earlier than the threshold. So I want a hard knee, so only when it passes the threshold will it start to compress. So ratio is just the amount. So at 100 to 1, you're basically limiting the sound. I have a fast attack, so the compressor is going to kick in as soon as the threshold is surpassed. And release, I'm also going to have a very quick release. I recommend turning any auto gain off on whatever compressor you use if you have it. It just really makes it harder to hear the compressor because you're already compensating. So now if I turn this on, it should be pretty much nothing getting through. So here you can see the transients, and that red line at the top is the threshold, and also the red line will show you the gain reduction. So let's bring the threshold down and you'll see that because the ratio is turned up very high, we'll very quickly start to see some compression. That red line will drop down. So let's go somewhere like here, halfway. So the threshold is down here, and you can see these red spikes. That's showing you where the gain reduction is happening. Should be able to hear that the kick drum and the snare drum is a little bit quieter. Let's now increase the threshold even more, so we're going to really overdo it. There you go, pretty much nothing getting through there. So that is downward compression in action. We are compressing everything down, we're turning down the dynamic range. But if you set it more here, you're going to kind of turn just down the kick drum and the snare drum. So yeah, the kick and the snare I'll turn down a little bit there, making the dynamic range a little bit more even, a little bit less spiky, if you like. So once we've done that, what we then tend to do is turn up the makeup gain to make up for the fact that we've turned it down. So if we look at the RMS before we start and the peak values, so let's bypass the compressor, and now let's look at the peak and the RMS here. So we've got -3 peak. Minus 24, 25 RMS. And now I'm going to turn this on. Minus 12 peak. and minus 30 RMS. So the average level is lower and the peak is lower. So what we want to do is we turn down the peaks with the compressor. Now we want to bring up the makeup gain to bring up the overall RMS. And you can see here, there's your input, there's your output, and you can see that they're pretty much even, but it sounds louder when I apply the compressor. So that's where we reduce the peak so that we can increase the overall RMS. So minus 20, 18 here, with it engaged, turn it off, and then this is jumping up now. So that's downward compression in a nutshell. Hopefully that made sense. Next, we're going to look up at some upwards compression. So I've got some bass here, just like a slap bass boogie kind of thing. So the thing about compression is we're reducing the dynamic range. So when it comes to upwards compression, we're going to kind of compress up to the threshold. So it kind of works the other way around now, but we are still technically decreasing dynamic range because the quieter stuff is going to get louder up to a threshold. So what I've got here is Pro MB by FabFilter Open. This is a multi-band compressor, but you can put it into single band just by creating a new band from the full spectrum. I want to set the threshold at 0. I want to set the range at 0, and we're doing compression, not expansion. We're going to come on to expansion in a second. We want to make sure the knee is hard, so we don't have any of that early compression happening. We want the ratio to be high so that we hear it. Normally you wouldn't put them this high. I'm just exaggerating these things so that you can really hear them. Attack's going to be quite quick, and the release is going to be quite quick. So when we turn this on, we shouldn't really hear anything happening. Okay, so when it comes to compression upwards, we need to change the range. So range by default on a downwards compressor will be something like that. Most downward compressors, normal compressors, won't have a range control. But because we're going to increase it, because we're going to do some upwards compression here, you'll notice that the range can then go into the positive, and that's what we want to do. We want to kind of bring, let's bring it up to 10, let's say. So now what happens if we turn it on? Okay, so everything got louder. I'm going to turn it down a little bit. So basically, because I've got the threshold set so high, it's meaning anything that does not come up to the threshold yet will be pushed up to it, essentially. So if I bring the threshold all the way down, you're not going to hear anything. And now let's slowly bring it up. Now you should be able to hear it. So the quieter bits are getting pushed up. So this is basically turning up the gain of anything below the threshold. And because everything is pretty much falling below the threshold here, it's turning up everything. Let's try it on a drum groove instead, actually. So we've got a drum groove in there now instead. Bring up the range. Okay, so now do you hear that? You can hear that kind of pumping of the quieter bits as they're being pushed up in volume towards the louder stuff. See it moving there. Bring up. So we're reducing the dynamic range because the louder stuff is getting pushed upwards towards it, rather than before with the downwards compression, we're reducing the range, but the louder stuff was coming down. Now it's the quieter stuff coming up. So when I turn it back on, you're now going to hear a lot more of the kind of tails of the sounds coming up, the kick drum coming up, like the tail, and the gaps coming up more. Ride's also noticeably a lot louder, right? And we can once again check it on the meter. So bypass. Around -3 and -25-ish. Average. Peaks similar. And the RMS is slightly louder. So you've really got the option, you can either compress everything down or you can compress everything up. But it's still compression, it's not expansion, because we are reducing dynamic range. When you're expanding, you're increasing dynamic range. So that's the key thing to remember between the difference between these. Okay, so now let's move on to some expansion. So let's take a look at some upwards expansion. Got the bass again. Nice slappy little thing. Let's start with a fresh Pro MB. And I'm going to put in a full band. And this time we want to click on expansion. I'm going to put the threshold at 0. The range, we are doing upward expansion, so we need to put the range going upwards. So let's say, let's dial in 10 for now. I'm going to have a hard knee, so knees all the way down there. This time we're expanding, so we're increasing the dynamic range. But now let's bring this threshold down a bit. Now it's getting a lot louder now because it is increasing the dynamic range. So where the threshold is set, it's just making everything above that threshold expand, get louder. So as you can see, we're starting to distort. So if you want to boost, say, a kick and a snare, or you want to boost part of a signal, this is really good time to use expansion if you want to create more dynamics in a particular frequency range. So I've gone full band here and it's kind of affecting everything and bringing everything up and making everything louder. If I turn the threshold all the way down, that's like a lot, right? If we make this just to affect the top end, so the top end is going to be more the popping, kind of the more fingers on the bass rather than the low end boomy. So let's, if I solo it. So that's the band we're going to affect. Let's decrease the threshold. Can you see how much that's affecting the top end, the kind of fingers, the popping side of it now? Bypassed. So we're increasing the dynamic range here. We're making that top end louder. So that is upwards expansion in a nutshell. And if you want to see it on the meter, bypassed. Peak is 7-ish. RMS is 20-ish. Let's turn it on. Peak way higher now. And RMS 20, 23. So the RMS is staying roughly the same, the average level staying kind of similar with the expansion, but the peak is now so much higher. And because we set the upper range level at +10, it's only going to go as high as +10. But and compare that now too. Now you've got a lot more kind of poppiness, at least in that top end of the bass, and that's upward expansion. So that's one way you can increase dynamic range, by using expansion. So you can also do downward expansion, which is so weird getting your head around it, let's be honest. So I've got some drums here, and the best way to think of downward expansion is to think of noise gates. That's essentially what they're doing here. So let me, same drum groove again. Got a fresh multiband from Pro MB, full band again, and it's compressing, so we want to put it to expansion. Range is at 0, nothing happening. Let's turn the ratio up, and the knee is going to be on hard, so it's not going to come in early, it's going to only kick in when that threshold's exceeded. Okay, so we want to bring the range down for downward expression, so we're going to be affecting this area. Let's bring it all the way down here. Let's go for -30, and I'm going to turn the threshold all the way down, and as I bring it up, it's going to start doing the downwards expansion. It's going to start bringing everything down that is at the threshold level. Now you can hear it. Really low cymbals, the room sound, that's getting cutting out. You're starting to hear things drop out. And as I go up, it's going to bite into more of the kick drum and the snare drum. So they will be the last things standing, if you like. So pretty much everything is being taken out there. It's basically a noise gate. So here you've got everything cutting out, but we want to increase the dynamic range here. So say we're reducing just that ride cymbal. So if we set it somewhere around here, so the dynamic range, the range of dynamics has now got bigger. So that's expansion. So yeah, this is perfect for like if you want to gate something. And that is downward expansion. And you can do some of these in Logic. You can obviously do downward compression just using the standard compressor. As you know, that will do downward compression for you. And then you've also got an expander here under Dynamics Expander. So this is just single band, but you can also go into the multi-band, and the multi-band has expansion on it as well. But yeah, so if you wanted to do the same thing here, you've only got upwards expansion. So you can see the expansion happening here. I'm going to turn off the auto gain. So this is upward expansion happening here, and the kick and the snare are getting louder. It's increasing that dynamic range, and it's just focusing on bringing up the kick and the snare really here. See, when I mute it, you hear more of the cymbals, the ringingness of the cymbals. So that is upward compression, downward compression, upward expansion, downward expansion. Are you confused? I hope so. Dynamics processing in general, I think, are a lot harder to hear and are more complicated and difficult to get your head around. So just be patient. If you're confused about compression or expansion, just open up an expander on a drum loop or on a bass part, and the same for a compressor, and just play with the settings until you start to realize things. Hope you found that interesting. I hope it wasn't too confusing. If you have any questions about this, please let me know in the comments. If you like this video, then YouTube is going to be suggesting you watch one of these. See you soon.